Whenever you rent or buy a video, you need to be sure that the film you choose is suitable for the audience at home.
Do sit down. We're just about to have some tea.
Ladies and gentlemen, please do not panic, but scream. Scream for your lives.
Hey weirdos, the kettle's boiled. Welcome to Tea for Terror, where we take a favourite horror film and dissect it over a nice cuppa. I'm your host, Andrew Graves, and my guest today is absolutely ideal. Welcome, Graham Duff. How you doing, mate?
Hi, Andrew. Good to see you, man. I'm good. I'm good.
Thank you so much for coming on. It's really it's genuinely lovely to see you and for you to take part in this really means a lot.
It's a pleasure. I'm such a horror devotee that I'm always keen to talk about horror in its many forms. So no, it's a pleasure, man.
Well, I mean, that's been the great thing about doing this little podcast. I started, I don't know, about a year and a half ago doing this and just on my own and just getting people on and getting gradually braver and sort of approaching different people, thinking at first, oh, they're not going to come on. And then they do come on. And I think what is really lovely about it is the people I've had on just can't shut up about horror. And I love that. It's just because it's, how often do we have a situation where, lots of us horror fans, we don't, in everyday life, we don't necessarily get the opportunity to wax lyrical about it, do we? So I guess that's part and parcel of the reason why I did this, so people can get to talk about it. So for those that don't know, I'm sure that people do, but yeah, Graham is a brilliant writer and performer, and he's been involved in many different projects in terms of writing and TV and whatever. But probably one of the things that people will remember you for or know you best for is, and it's very topical because of stuff that's happening at the minute, but is for the amazing sitcom Ideal starring Johnny Vegas, which was one of the most surreal, brilliant, kitchen sink, horror-esque sitcoms ever made. And if you're sitting here and you're thinking, what on earth is he talking about? Go to BBC iPlayer and watch all of the series of Ideal, because it is absolutely superb.
I'm really glad I came on now. Thanks for that. Ideal is. I mean, it's interesting. I think because that thing that like you're doing there, you slightly struggle to say exactly what it is because it covers quite a lot of ground. And I think that's something I'm really proud of, that it is a mixture of, like, somebody called it social surrealism. So it's like realistic, but it's very surreal, and lots of music, lots of horror. I'm always interested in how things work outside of genre. I think, as a writer, that's one thing that fascinates me. It's like, what happens if you put a really romantic, genuinely romantic thing in the middle of a horror, or a really horrific thing in the middle of a comedy? And can you get away without hearing the gear shift? That's always something that's fascinated me.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, what with Ideal, it was, to me, it's like, because I've written loads of stuff. I did a book called Welcome to the Cheap Seats, which is like a sort of a history of British working class cinema and things like that.
Yeah.
So I really love the idea of kind of working class stuff and that kind of kitchen sink stuff. But the thing that annoys me slightly is that it's always kind of pigeonholed. If you're doing something about working class stuff, it's got to be kitchen sink, it's got to be kind of Saturday night, Sunday morning, it's got to be all these things. And I think, but there's a weirdness there as well, which is not always explored. It's not just all about misery and sort of Ken Loach, Mike Leigh stuff, which is great, but there's a different side of it. And I think that's the best thing about Ideal. It mashes all these ideas up, and the characters are so outlandish yet so believable at the same time.
Well, yeah, that's one of the weird things about the characters, because some people will say about certain characters, that's so weird, that would never happen, and then other people come up to me and say, I wondered if you based that on this mate of mine. I think, well, it can't be both, can it? Or maybe it can. I don't know. We're in a really fortunate position with our deal now, because it's all just back on iPlayer, so you can see all 7 series. So that's really good, because for about 10 years it wasn't.
Yeah.
You just couldn't access it unless you bought the DVDs. But we're actually doing a tour of a live show of it later in the year. So so I've been writing those characters again, which has been really really enjoyable. And I realised I still had plenty to say about them as well. So that's, it's the new show isn't just going to be like a celebration. And also, I'm hoping the intention is that even if you've never seen a single frame of the TV thing, you can still enjoy the live show, because it's got a gripping and horrific story. So yeah, that's the plan.
It was I think it's series 6, I think, which is with Fisk, and that's the Ben Wheatley. Didn't Ben Wheatley direct most of those episodes?
Ben Wheatley directed series 5 and series 6. Yeah. So yeah, he did about, I think it's about 15 episodes that Ben did. Yeah. So yes, Fist is an interesting character. That's a character I came up with when I was 19, and did it in a stage show, and then it came back several years later.
Yeah, and I think that is the other thing. It's got all those things of some of those ideas. It's that character in particular. It's almost so ridiculous that it could be not scary, but it is scary. It's almost akin to stuff like Wurzel Gummidge. There are parts in Wurzel Gummidge which are absolutely terrifying. I think the Daft Ed character is just fucking horrendous. It's terrifying. And I think it's that kind of element in that, I think.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? That the sort of how the quotidian can sometimes be unsettling, and it's like say in Ideal, the character Psycho Paul, the fact that we always hear that he kills people with a screwdriver, and so it's like, well, that's so much more unsettling and grotesque than if they said, oh, he kills them with a knife. A screwdriver, you just suddenly think that's really horrible, and yet a screwdriver is just an everyday object. So I like trying to combine those elements, I think I've always been wary of stuff where working class characters are depicted as just sort of like either savants or grotesques or something. So like they're out of touch with themselves. They don't know who they are. And I just think that's bollocks, really, because, the working class culture is so strong. You look at in recent years how big folk horror has become. Well, the folk are the working class. These are the people of the land. So it's like this idea that there's different kinds of humor or different kinds of art for different generations, different stratas of society, I think is wrong. I think I do like it. I'm not a huge fan, but I think something like Blackadder is a really good example of something where you've got really clever intellectual jokes and you've got sort of fart gags and sex. It's all in there together, and I think there's no reason not to do that. There's no League of Gentlemen, another example of that. I think there's a real argument for being able to combine so many different elements of culture and art.
Yeah. So just going back slightly then. So what was your kind of entry route into horror then?
I would imagine my trajectory is a very common one, particularly for people of my generation. As a kid, I was massively into Doctor Who from before I can remember. Apparently, from before I can even remember, I was like, that was my main thing. So very late 60s, early 70s, that was, all I lived for, really. And I became, I sort of knew a little bit about the notion of like Dracula and Frankenstein and that, but, you couldn't see it on TV. And if it was on late at night, and I was a kid. And then in the late, I think that's 1976, the BBC started screening horror double bills on a Saturday night. There'd be a Universal one followed by a Hammer one usually, and down to Leslie Halliwell, apparently, that those were all being screened. That he'd suggested buying this sort of bundle of horrors, and so the first double bill of that I saw when I was staying at my grandparents', because my parents, I know, wouldn't have let me watch them, but my grandparents did. And it was Devil Doll, followed by Frankenstein Created Woman. And that that was a turning point in my life, basically. I've almost finished my next book, which is called CinemaScope: A Life in 15 Films, and it's 15 different films from key points in my life. And Frankenstein Created Woman is one of them, because it was like, I'd always loved monsters. I'd always loved the idea of, my drawings had lots of blood in them, stuff. I was very, inclined in that way. But seeing Frankenstein Created Woman, which is actually a very gentle introduction to the world of Hammer. There's no real gore. There isn't even really a proper monster. It's almost like a Bronte sisters story in a way. Part of it. This is very romantic. But that was my entry point. And after that, a few months after that, I got hold of the Alan G. Frank horror movies book, or the Bible, as I call it. And that was it. So
I mean,
that was my entry point.
those two books. I mean, the Alan Frank book, the pictorial, the history, movie treasury, Alan Frank, and then the pictorial history of horror by Dennis Gifford. I mean, I've still got both,
Yeah, me too.
But I was always Alan Frank. I came to Alan Frank before Gifford, and that
same.
And that was like, I think I've gone in my lifetime. I think I've gone through 3 versions of that book, because they gradually fell apart. And it was just trying to do that thing of trying to watch everything in that book, and not being able to just simply download them or stream them or buy them on video. You literally had to wait for them to come on television, or as many of them was possible. And so those double bills. Yeah, and what's great about those double bills as well is that you can, because of the Genome Project and all that stuff, you can go back and look at those copies of the Radio Times. It's almost like you can track your childhood and like, okay, this is exactly this is where it happened,
Absolutely. I mean, I remember, I think, would it be Thursdays? Wednesdays or Thursdays, we used to get the Radio Times coming through the door. And I would sit down, with my bowl of breakfast cereal before school, and just go through looking for horror, just see if there was anything on, and then getting the newspapers. And sometimes there'd be a horror film on ITV on Friday evenings as well. And it was just, you were sort of harvesting all these things that you'd been told about. And quite often, the film, you'd know the title, you might have a little bit about it, but you'd just seen one image from it. And then you had that thing, and then you watch the program, and that exact image wouldn't be in, because it was a publicity still, a publicity photograph, not a frame from the. And he'd always say, "Oh, that's a different angle. Oh, you can't really see it. That's in the distance." Well, I thought it was a close up, and so that added another layer of sort of intangibility to it, that it always just felt slightly out of reach the whole time. And also sometimes you'd see things on TV, and the scene that you'd heard about had been cut or trimmed, so you weren't seeing what you thought you were going to see as well. So it was a very elusive hobby, I think, sort of tracking down horror films at that point.
The classic example for me from the Alan Frank book is there was a series of images from The Mummy where he's having his tongue cut out, and you actually see the tongue coming out, and that I was obsessed with that as a kid, and I finally got to see The Mummy, so that's not in.
I know.
I imagine it was in some sort of European cuts, but it definitely wasn't in the version I saw.
It's very tantalizing, all that stuff.
Yes, and of course, as people often have pointed out, I think Mark Gatiss points it out on his History of Horror series, but that also from the Alan Frank book, that infamous image from Freaks, which just absolutely fascinated me as a kid. And I probably didn't get to see Freaks from seeing that original picture. I probably didn't it was probably about 10 years before I actually saw Freaks, and it never stopped being an obsession for me. And now obviously we can get a nice Blu-ray version of it, but all of those kind of things. And I think it created more of a, because I'm not knocking streaming. Streaming is great. We've got access to everything now. But at the same time, not having instant access meant the connections we had with those things were much more tangible in a way, because we became obsessed with them.
Yeah, and also, it's a lot of these, obviously, that we're talking about, we would have seen before even the advent of video. So you had to drink it in, and you had to think about it in order to preserve it in your mind, because it wasn't going to be on again, or if it was going to be several years in the future. So it's like I felt like I mean, the risk of sounding like an old man, is it was all better then. Really don't believe it was all better then. I think a lot of things were way, way worse.
Yeah.
But excuse me. But I think there was a time where it had this sort of magical quality that you almost had to keep the flame in your mind in your life, a flame alive in your mind, to sort of retain this information. And I was into drawing, so I'd always draw the stuff as well.
And it's always been like, I had a black and white portable telly in my bedroom, as a lot of people would have done. And it was just getting close to that, so you weren't disturbing your parents. And it was like, even though you were absolutely knackered, you could not go to sleep. You had to stay awake and watch the end of
Yeah,
this whole film. It was just, all of that. It's kind of, I
yeah,
think in some ways you look back and think it's a fucking inconvenient. It's it's much easier to stream it, but something made it
gotcha.
kind of an experience. Uh,
Yeah.
okay, so I think it's time to introduce the film we're going to be looking at. So, on this episode, we're going to look at Graham's choice is Scream and Scream Again from 1970, directed by Gordon Hessler.
She has never really existed yet. You see, she's been assembled piece by piece, organ by organ. She's a composite, like Keith. Keith? Yes, you remember the so-called vampire killer.
So, Graham, when did you first come across this film?
I saw this at a really interesting time in terms of my what you might call cinematic development. So I saw this in the autumn of 1979. I was 15, so I'd been into horror since I was like 76. So that's 3 years of horror. But about 8 months before this, I had seen. Me and my friend Pete snuck in to see an X film, as they were at the time. It was The Man Who Fell to Earth, and that just blew my mind. Nominally science fiction, but it's so much more. I think it's a fabulous piece of work. This sort of dazzling mosaic of ideas and images. So I saw that, and that sort of set me off down another path, being aware of like art house films, as we call them now, and European films. And again, BBC Two, God bless them, on Saturday nights, on Sunday nights rather, they'd quite often show a sort of more left field film. So I was getting into that stuff as well, with like fractured narratives and all this, but I was still into horror, but horror had stopped being my one true love. I was broadening out at this stage. And then I saw Scream and Scream Again when I was 15, and this seemed to sort of embody both notions. Really, it was quite a full-on horror film in terms of some of the images and the ideas, but also it had this associative structure which I found really unusual. And everybody tells you initially you can't make head nor tail of it. It's a real, talk about a mosaic. This is a real sort of abstract journey. It seems once you've seen it a few times, you realize what's going on and how it all interconnects. But yeah, it's a bizarre experience. How old were you when you first saw it?
Well, I think it would have. I think it would have been the showing that you saw possibly was the same one that I saw, if it was on ITV or whatever, if it's on
Yeah.
whichever network. But I would have been around 9 or 10 when I saw that. So
Wow.
and because my parent, as I've said often, my parents being 70s parents were fairly lax. They didn't really they were okay with watching horror films, and most of the
Yeah.
stuff that I watched, those double bills, I absolutely loved them. So I got a vicarious thrill out of them. But most of the stuff didn't really affect me. It didn't give me nightmares. I just lapped it up. I loved it.
Yeah.
The only films I can remember from that sort around that age watching that actually really did affect me were The Mummy that we mentioned earlier. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'd seen loads of other Hammer films. They didn't really bother me in that way. The Mummy, there was something about The Mummy really terrified me. And
Right.
Scream and Scream Again. And I'm not just saying this because you chose it. I have very vivid memories about watching Scream and Scream Again. I don't even know if I watched all the film the first time it was
Right.
on. There was something I kind of had. A lot of kids go through this, I think. Maybe it's more highlighted now, but certainly kids of all generations, I think, have always kind of like little. I think you go through a phase of having a bit of OCD and stuff and being
Mm.
obsessed with certain things. And this sounds really odd and freakish, but I had a thing when I was growing up as a kid about amputations. I was terrified of having an
Mm.
accident or having to have a leg removed. And I think it was to do with watching like Reach for the Sky and stuff like that. It kind of freaks me
Yes.
out a little bit. And this film absolutely nailed that sort of fear because I mean the opening scene to this film is terrifying. You know, you got
Yeah.
the pre-credit sequences, you got this bloke. He's jogging, he's just running across the heath or whatever, and then he collapses. And then we cut to him a little bit later on, and he's in hospital, or what we think is a hospital. Obviously, it's not a proper hospital, it's this
Yeah.
experimentation place. But he's in bed, and then, you know, and then suddenly it dawns on them that something's not right. And it makes it even more creepy because he can't. It's almost like he's paralyzed, and you know, the nurse keeps coming in and putting the drinking thing in his mouth or whatever, the
Mm.
food or whatever, and then he rolls back the sheets, and of course he's missing a leg, and we keep coming back to this guy throughout the film, and every time we come back to him, he's lost another limb, and it's that just I was terrified. You know, and it's one of those nights where I went to bed after seeing however much I did got through, and I just didn't sleep a wink, and I was absolutely terrified. And I remember vividly just walking around in a daze the day after. It's kind of like fairly sunny, I think, seeing my mates, and it was like. And it's almost like like a big bombshell on me. I was just walking. I could not function. I was just it
Wow.
freaks me
Yeah.
out so much. It's really odd, and I have so vivid memories about that film.
I mean, I think that's one of its real strengths, actually, and it has an embarrassment of riches. I think this film, and we've not even touched on the fact yet that it stars Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, and Peter Cushing, but we can talk about that in a bit. But I think one of the things it does really acutely is it keys into a lot of very primal fears. So, like fear of losing a limb, and another, and another, and another. Fear of torture, fear of rape, fear of dehumanization. It's got so many sort of things going on that it presses your buttons, and and I think because it also disorientates you because you're cutting at least initially between three completely separate storylines, all of which seem to be completely untethered, in which there's people being murdered, there's this guy having limbs amputated, there's people being captured and tortured in a fascist state, and it's very, very bleak. And I think one thing that really thrilled me about it at the time is it's really modern. And it's obviously it's shot in '69. It wasn't released until the year later. But even watching it now, it's got the trappings of the '60s in it, and so on, and the music, and you got the nightclub that goes by the name of the Busted Pot, and so on. So in some respects, it's very of its era. But in terms of like this notion of like technology dehumanizing people, fear of like your helplessness against a fascist state and all this stuff, it retains its relevance whenever you watch it, I think.
Yeah, and I think again, you know, that the whole thing of this experimental hospital and this kind of fascists and all this kind of medical experiments going on and all this stuff, and you know, yeah, I think that is. I mean, you mentioned Doctor Who, and I think as much as I love the Daleks, the Cybermen always kind of they freaked me out more because it was this idea of spare part surgery, sort of gradually stripping away any essence of being human being. And obviously,
Yeah.
you know, when they kind of came up with that concept, it was very much tapping into those early 60s fears about plastic surgery and all this kind of, or even just this idea of lots of women being prescribed kind of Valium and actually losing their humanity through that. I think, you know,
Mm.
all of this kind, and obviously this is very much of a similar sort of era as well. And I think there's also, I mean, again, I've mentioned this lots and lots of times before, but it's my favorite era in some ways of British cinema, that sort of crossover between the late 60s and early 70s. I think because of the way the film industry was kind of struggling, and the one of the sort of byproducts was you could often get actors cheap. You can get really good actors.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
this is why you have those Amicus films. I mean, this is a kind of unofficial Amicus film, but we have those Amicus films with incredible casts because, you know, this all this stuff, and because television, they were having to compete with television. the things. So the cinema was trying to chuck on screen things you couldn't necessarily access on television. So whether it was over the top horror, whether it was sex, or whether it was a feature length version of your favorite sitcom, so all that you had to go to the cinema to see that. But as well as that, you got this kind of experimentation. So desperation leads to experimentation. I think you get these really bizarre, crazy, strange, bonkers horror films like Scream and Scream Again, or even, a little bit later on, Psychomania, which is just fucking mental. So
Yeah.
it's a brilliant era.
It really is, and I think when I was first watching it, like I said, I was 15. I'd been a big fan of the Avengers, and some of it feels quite like the Avengers. I think the way it's shot, it's got a feeling of that kind of energy to it, but also it does feel like it's an illogical extension of some of the ideas that we're seeing in sort of TV sci-fi as well. Because there's this notion that there's people in position, monsters, if you like, or aliens, in positions of power within the government and so on. And that's, you see that in Nigel Neal's Quatermass too, and also in Spearhead from Space, which would have gone out on TV round about the same time this was being screened. So it's really picking up on that sort of pre-Watergate paranoia in a way. That sort of like we're already sort of at the mercy of the other. I think that's in there definitely. It's I always think of it as an Amicus film, but it's a co-pro, isn't it? Isn't it
Yeah.
really? But and it's a bit of an anomaly within the Amicus oeuvre. But I think that thing about that you're saying that this era was like is the most exciting era, and I think it is, and this film is a perfect bridge, because, like I say, shot in '69, not released to '70, and it's a turning point, I think, in terms of a number of things in British horror, because obviously Amicus had done well, but Hammer was the name. Hammer had dominated horror throughout the '60s and would continue to be a big name for the next few years. But that kind of storytelling sort of harks back more to the golden age of Hollywood. There's sort of morality tales, good triumphs over evil, everyone learns their lesson, evil's vanquished. And Amicus always took a different route, in that quite often it's evil that triumphs, and quite often, innocent people will be killed, and the horror continues. And as the credits roll, we get this idea that the horror will roll on beyond, and that like more people will be destroyed or whatever. So I think that's an interesting thing, and I think that is what we see more of in horror as you go into the '70s. Morality changes, and I think this what's fascinating about, or another thing that's fascinating about Scream and Scream Again, is this is where that tonal shift starts. So you've got the films of Pete Walker are coming up. You've got a number of films that will, like The Road Builder or Night Hare Child and so on, that start to like the tone is different, the morality is different. It's much darker. It's much more abject, and that there isn't, once you get away from top hats and bonnets and castles, it's all a little bit more in your face, because it's in the real world, and it's not going to end well.
Yeah, I mean, that was always the thing. I love Hammer, I love Hammer horror, those
Absolutely.
classic Hammer. And I think what was great about them sometimes, you mentioned, Frankenstein Created Woman, and a few of those others, like the Reptile and
Mm.
Plague of Zombies. It's they very often, even though Hammer as a company, they all, they had this brilliant production line of horror films, which were incredible. And yet, because of some of the directors and writers they were using, you'd often get these surreptitious kind of political messages. Hammer, a lot of Hammer films, even on the sort of on the more basic footing, they were very, I'm not saying Hammer as a company was being political, but you got these kind of messages through that were very, it's always kind of, I don't think it's any coincidence in Hammer films. You've got the villains tend to be these landed gentry types, Dracula's account or the Baron, all this
Yeah.
kind of, and they end up being vanquished. But I think some of those films, like Frankenstein Created Woman, the politics is slightly more elevated, I think, and particularly it's something like Plague of Zombies, it's very much a kind of
Yeah.
class war going on in there. But with Amicus, particularly with those brilliant portmanteau films. yeah, like you said, the morality was slightly off. You know, some of those portmanteau films, some of the episodes, it's kind of, yeah, you can see this character's asking for it. They are very
Mm.
immoral, so they're going to get it. But then others, it's like, what has this character done to deserve
Yeah,
this?
I know.
Terrible, you know. And
Yeah,
you know, and I think probably the high. I love all those portmanteau. I think the highlight for me is From Beyond the Grave. I think, you know, it's just that, and particularly the episode with, you know, with Donald Pleasance and Angela Pleasance. It's just there's
yeah,
something so, and I know that Reece Shearsmith talked about that episode a lot as well, and it's such a great snapshot. And I think that, like, because obviously Amicus was an American company over here, they were able to see Britain in a way and create. They understood. They could see the grottiness of it, I think, and I think that that's
yeah.
what is presented. It's similar in a similar way to like Jose Larraz, who made his best. I would argue his best films over
Yes,
here, and they are
yeah, I'd
so
agree. Yeah.
grotty and horrible, but brilliant. And I think there's something about capturing, as an outsider, capturing what it is to be Britain in the early 70s, which usually wasn't that nice.
Yeah, no, I think it's very true, and yeah, I don't want to sound like I'm bad mouthing Hammer
No,
because I'm
no,
an
no, no.
enormous fan of Hammer. And I think, yeah, that, like you say, Plague of Zombies, I think is fabulous. I really like a lot of the later ones as well, which I know don't find as much favour, but I think a lot of the late 70s ones, where they're having to up their game, you know, all the time with things like Satanic Rites of Dracula, say, or Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. I think those are really strong, vibrant works. But yeah, and I'm an enormous Hammer fan. But yeah, there is something about Amicus, and as well, you know, with the portmanteaus, as I do every so often. I've recently rewatched them this year. I've watched all of them, and also Tales of Witness Madness and various other anthology things. I'm a huge fan of those. One thing that gets overlooked a lot with the Amicus ones is a lot of those stories were written by Robert Bloch.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
You know, and it's like he's sort of revered for Psycho. It's like there's so many other great little vignettes there that are just, you know, in 8 or 9 minutes you have this whole story. You've got characters you engage with. You got usually good strong twists. I think my favourites are probably Tales from the Crypt and the Torture Garden, but every single one has got great stories in. And as you were saying, you know, because they were quite often they'd only be sort of booking an actor for a day or 2 days to shoot these things. Amazing casts, you know, like powerhouse casts. And again, it's that thing of like, it feels modern. It feels very sort of, you can feel the texture of it, you know, the interiors and the cars and the clothes and everything. It's got a real intimacy to it as well. I think it's a very powerful work.
You mentioned Tales of Witness Madness there. I mean, that's not an Amicus thing, but
No.
it's you know, it was obviously very much riffing on Amicus, trying to tap into that.
Yeah.
But that film is fucking mental.
Yes, I know. It's one of those things that it's like there's a few of those, and I think whenever you watch them, you just sort of think, do you know, I can't quite get used to this. And obviously, I've watched, you know, thousands of hours of horror, but with some of these, you just think, like the one with the tiger in that is just so bizarre. And then the last sequence with the sort of you know, exoticized sort of you know, that all that stuff going on there. It's like a lot of it is really unpredictable, you know. So some of them move so quickly.
Collins, poor old Joan Collins, when she read that script, what, he's going to throw me over for a tree trunk? What are you talking about?
Yeah, I gotta say, I wish I could live in their house in that store. That's a
Yeah,
great
yeah,
house.
Yeah.
And all the hard drinking. Everybody's always drinking neat spirits. No mixers, no ice, just like knocking back whiskey and brandy all the time.
Yeah, and you can smell the sweat and you can feel the cigarette smoke. It's just something about those films from that era. They're just great. There's so much texture going on the screen. You know, you can feel it. You know, a lot of them, particularly those Jose Larraz films from that era. You know, you literally, it's one of those films that they're those kind of films. They're like you need a shower after watching them.
I know.
Rubbish.
When in Vampires, when they're sitting in the caravan, you say, "Oh God,
yeah."
I tell you, get out of the caravan, get into the mansion with the lesbians, for God's sake."
I know, it's just that cat. I recently, because I do a lot of film talks at the Broadway, and I was talking about vampires, and it's just like trying to explain to someone and not seeing it. It's like, yeah, it's kind of, they're sitting around in this shitty kind of Father Ted type caravan, stirring the beans. It's
Oh
so
no.
boyish.
So that's one of the things I love about Pete Walker's films of
Yeah,
that
yeah,
era
yeah,
as
yeah.
well. It's like the real world is part of the problem. The real, there's this like you got ineffectual heroes, just like drifting through the real world, and it's a grim and grubby place. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it adds a layer of kind of more scariness in some ways, particularly because I think some ways I felt safe watching horror films as a kid because the victims or the people who were being chased around by monsters in a lot of those British things, whether it was TV shows or Tales from the Unexpected or whatever, or whether it was kind of films, is they're all very middle class. They're all characters that called each other darling and sort of had cocktails at dinner time and whatever.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
just thought, well, I'm safe then because they ain't coming to a
yeah,
shelter last. Then you see Amicus and it's like, maybe I'm not so safe. Maybe it's a bit more kitchen sink than I was expecting. So
yeah.
it does add that layer to it, I think. Yeah. And it's always like, I think, again, mentioned this before, but it's almost like those 70s films. So you had like Dinah Dawes in the sort of 50s and 60s, who was kind of the sex symbol. And by the time you get to the sort of early 70s, she's kind of put on a little bit of weight or whatever. She's still a good actor, but it's almost like her representation on screen is almost kind of like coincides with the way the country's going. It's kind of, it's something, it's gone a little bit wrong. It's not the same as it was. So yeah, it's a really fascinating era, I think. Yeah, so earlier on you mentioned Scream and Scream Again, and you talked about the fact that the first few times you saw it, it was fairly unfathomable, and there's certain elements of it which you didn't really get or understand, and obviously now it's kind of makes more sort of linear sense. But you know what? I think I'm still in the camp that doesn't really I don't really understand what's going on. I kind of obviously I do in terms of the wider stuff that's going on, but the thing that confuses me because you were mentioning it's a fascist state, but I'm not sure if the way it gels on screen, and perhaps it's me missing something that it ever really. I could never work out whether it's an actual fascist state or whether there is a growing fascist kind of clandestine movement that's behind the scenes. I don't know whether it's because none of the other characters seem to mention that they're in a fascist state. You know what I mean? So I don't.
Yeah. Well, I think there's the strand of the story that's got Conrance and Benedek in, and where we see what's she called, Yutka. God, I forgot the actress's name now. Jut Stensgaard, is it? Where she gets
Yes.
kidnapped. So, I mean, it's clearly a fascist state in that they've got a very Nazi-inspired flag. They've got
Yeah.
military rule. They're controlling the people. They're just snatching people off the streets or out of the countryside or whatever. So that is clearly going on. And I think there's this implication. Well, so here's the thing. So it's based on a book originally
The
called
Disorientated Man. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was adapted, and I don't know what Milton Subotsky's original script would have looked like, because obviously that's not the script that was made. It was taken over by Chris Wickling. But it'd be interesting to see how much that follows or deviates from the book, because I don't know if you've read the book, but basically the film is always criticized as being, it's too difficult to understand. It's really inchoate, disconnected. The film pretty much follows the book scene by scene. There are two scenes in the book, or two sequences in the book, that don't make it into the film. One of which is in the fascist state, where you see Conrance go into this sort of labyrinthian area where there's a library, which is a very brief bit. But the key bit that is missed out of the film is in the opening chapter. Aliens land on Earth.
Yeah.
And so that would have been would have given you a completely different way into the story. I think what's happened is aliens have landed on Earth. The first place they've got a strong foothold is this unknown fascist state, which seems to be somewhere in Eastern Europe. And then they've been making the composite beings, and they're sending them out across the world to infiltrate other countries. And we see how it playing out in Britain. We can tell there's other stuff going on, because when they talk about one of the airmen having been captured by the fascist state, that's a British airman. So I think I think Christopher Lee's character is like under a lot of pressure because all around him people are being replaced by composites, and he doesn't know who's who anymore. And so I think that's what's happening there. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
No, yeah, I know. I think the script. I think the original script. They did have these scenes that were alluding to the fact that they were aliens, but I think that for whatever reason, I don't know whether it's because they wanted to make it less sci-fi and more horror. I don't know, but they took out these references to them
Mm,
actually being aliens. So that's that looking at it that way, that's why it possibly has this kind of slightly more disjointed feel. Because I mean, it doesn't make any difference. It still makes it a very. I mean, I quite like that disjointedness, and I like the fact that there is no within the film context. There's no actual explanation. In a similar way that I mean, there've been other films, but in a similar way that Society, for instance, from
yeah.
'89, that it's never really fully explained. Obviously, it's the creatures and what happens is a very much a metaphor for extreme capitalism and all that, but you don't know whether it's never
No.
made explicit that they're aliens. It's just they're kind of just from somewhere else, this kind of strange beings. And I like that. I like when there's not really an explanation, even if it's by design or by default, whether someone's just been a bit heavy with the editing scissors or whatever, it still
Yeah.
works.
Yeah, it's true, and this may be, because part of my profession has been as a storyteller, but I'm always fascinated by stories where you're not spoon-fed, where there's a lot of interpretation, where there's loose ends to fiddle with after the film stops running, and I think we are used to, particularly in horror and sci-fi and say thrillers, spy thrillers, thing like that. We're used to, as the audience, being handed this godlike perspective. So suddenly we understand the whole nature of what's going on here, and what the hierarchical structure is, and what the first point of the story was, and where it's like. And I think that isn't how we experience life. We're all bit players, so we experience fragments of life and we piece it together. And I'm sure you've had this experience. Sometimes you will look back at something that happened, 20 years earlier, and we'll suddenly understand they said that because that, or there was this alliance I didn't understand about. But in real time, we don't really know what's exactly is going on. And I think particularly a story like Scream and Scream Again, which it's about conspiracy, it's about different layers of society, it's about who's got information, who hasn't, it's about who's following the correct course and who's going rogue. I think it's interesting to, as an audience member, to be presented by somebody you think you couldn't possibly, if you were living this, if something like this did happen, you couldn't possibly understand all the ramifications of what's going on. And you can draw a parallel with what's happening at the moment in America. It's like we understand the big strokes of the story, but in terms of all the intricacies, all the layers of conspiracy and who's involved in what and why certain businesses want to do this and why Trump's doing that, we can't possibly comprehend it all. There's no way. So I think, like I say, a story like this, I think really suits this incomplete understanding of the process and of the narrative.
Yeah, and I think that some of those parallels between what's happening now in America, which is just every fucking, it's not even every day, it's like every 10 minutes, just something is
Mm-hmm.
bombarding you. And I think it's almost like, but I think what's becomes increasingly clear, obviously what's happening in America is fascist by whatever name. It's that is what it is. But I don't necessarily think they were coming from the same place as Hitler, say. Hitler had a kind of plan, if you like. There is no plan in America. It's just a handful of very, very, very greedy people trying to carve up the country for their own interests. The
Yeah.
quickest way to get there is fascism, and it's almost like. And everything that happens in America, everything's so out in the open. I mean, it's just there,
Yeah.
and there's nothing anybody can do, which kind of makes you feel when you watch this idea that you've got this kind of fascist state, but they're still partly shrouded with, in a more sort of secrecy. It's like, well, nobody's
Mm.
now. It's just there in your face. We're doing this, and it's like, oh, you can't do that. Yeah, but we are doing it, and it's just. It's really
Mm.
odd, and I think it does have this kind of resonance with what's going on now. Sadly, but yeah, I mean, to change the subject slightly, it's directed by Gordon Hessler, who didn't have like a huge career, but he also directed The Oblong Box, which I would have seen probably in the same sort of time slot as this film. I think there would, there were
Hmm.
certain films that would have been on BBC, and there were certain films that definitely would have been on ITV. I remember seeing most of the Amicus stuff on ITV. It would have been on ITV.
Yes, yeah,
And I think,
definitely, yeah.
and I think the Oblong Box and things like that, they were much more ITV films. So I definitely want to watch that. But the other thing that amuses me about
Yeah.
Gordon Hessler is that he also directed Kiss Meets the Phantom of the
Yeah,
Park, and
I know, I know.
I can't, I mean, I've got a massive crush on sort of mid 70s Kiss. And every time people tell me, oh, they're terrible in this, it's like, yeah, I know, but I love that
Yeah.
idea of them, the superhero comic book rock band. And Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park, I have a huge soft spot for that. But I just think Gordon Hessler was part German, part Brit. I just think, I am sure he had absolutely no idea who that band was and what he was doing on that project because it's,
I think, I mean, we'd worked with Hitchcock, hadn't he? He'd been
yeah,
involved in the, Alfred Hitchcock Presents and so on. But I think, it's one of those things where you just think, he sort of joined the game a little bit too late, I think. I mean, he's done some of the decent films. And of course, Golden Voyage of Sinbad was a massive hit, but there's some of the Scream Pity Preggy, the Bette Davis
yes,
TV
yeah.
movie he did. That's worth a watch. Embassy, not a bad thriller. I think the thing is with Scream and Scream Again, it's got a good argument to be a lot of people's best work. I think Chris Wickling was a really gifted screenwriter, and I think a lot of his script, I think his script for Cry of the Banshee is as verbally convoluted, if not as narratively convoluted, as Scream and Scream Again, and that's an acquired taste. And I've got to say, I think his script for To the Devil a Daughter is really strong as well. I think the direction lets it down at points, but I think that's a good script. I think he was a really smart writer, but Scream and Scream Again feels like that's his peak, and I think it's great performance from all the sort of horror, the triumvirate of horror stars. Well, obviously Cushing's only got one scene, but as ever, he sort of imbues it with believability and subtlety and stuff. And I think Vincent Price's performance is excellent. When he's first told of the scene where he's first told of that his secretary or his assistant had been murdered, he seems genuinely upset, and it's like he's not just upset by somebody that he knows has been killed. He seems even upset by the idea that something like death could exist, and it's a really nice bit of foreshadowing because obviously, as you go, you realize he lives in a world where death isn't necessarily a factor because he's got these composite characters, and it's even implied he might be a composite himself at the end,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that the
yeah.
acid is the only way that can destroy them. But I think also David Whittaker's score with all those sort of little free jazz touches and stuff. That's a really nice piece of work, and you listen to that as a soundtrack on its own. That's very punchy. So I think everybody's hitting it quite hard here. I think, and it really pays off. But I do think it casts a long shadow. I think for what came after.
Yeah, yeah, I think, getting back to the music, I mean, yeah, it's fantastic. And I think that again, a lot of those, early 70s British horror films, which unless you're a kind of horror aficionado or a real horror fan, you're probably not even aware of, or you won't really treat them seriously, had some of the best soundtracks, in the same way that a lot of the films from the same time from Italy, those Giallo films had incredible soundtracks. But I think that, something like, whatever you think about Psychomania, I love it, but the soundtrack is fucking brilliant. It's
Yeah, it is.
absolutely
It's excellent.
fantastic. And the same,
Yeah.
Blood on Satan's Claw is incredible as well. As the score on that is fantastic. All those
Yeah,
films.
yeah. There's some real Yeah, and it's funny because there's obviously something like The Wicker Man has become so revered, and as it should be, it's a fantastic piece of work, and so that score's really well respected. But somebody like Douglas Gamley, who scored most of the Amicus, you listen to that, you think this is really subtle, detailed work, and some of the little emotional shifts he articulates are gorgeous. But yeah, I think again this might be Whittaker's best score, and I think there's some sequences where he'll drop out so many of the instruments, and you've got just like sax and like hi-hat going and things like that. But I think another really interesting thing about this film is when they choose to not score. You've got this. The centerpiece of the film is that huge, lengthy car chase, which sort of stops and it starts again. And virtually all of that, there's no scoring. And that feels really rare for an early 70s film. You'd have a car chase and you just play it out with the sound of the engines. But it actually works really well because a lot of directors, less confident directors, would have thought, we need to score this and make sure this is really punchy. But actually, the lack of the score makes it feel like it's happening a little bit more in real time. And it feels more like the experience would be if you were there as well.
Yeah, definitely does. And I think there's just something like all these elements that we talked about, the threat of sexual assault, the threat of having your limbs removed, all of the like you said, it really taps into these kind of really base level fears that a lot of us have. But other than that, the fact that it is slightly disjointed because things were ripped out of the final version or edited out or whatever, it's one of those, it kind of, I don't know, it's almost like I can't put my finger on why it works. I knew why it terrified me as a kid, but there's something very unnerving and it doesn't necessarily go where you expect it to go. It doesn't, there are twists within the final sort of 15-20 minutes or whatever. There's all this kind of stuff, and it's also it's police procedural, it's fascist state stuff. It reminded me, I am pretty sure that Alan Moore would have seen this film, and I think there's a lot of V for Vendetta, a lot of this film in V for Vendetta. It's a very similar setup. It's a different kind of villain, if you like, but yeah. It feels very much a V for Vendetta film with that creeping fascist state and this other thing that's happening over the top of that, which is kind of out of control. But also in V for Vendetta, you've got all the kind of hints of medical experimentation, Nazi style experimentation. It's all there. It's and I know Alan Moore's a big fan of those kind of 60s, 70s horror films. So
I would be stunned if he hadn't seen it and been impacted by it. Yeah, I think that's true. A couple of things that we should probably mention that we've not touched on yet. One is the image of the hand hanging from the from the handcuff on the car bumper, which I think it's on screen for something like 3 or 4 seconds. It's very, very fleeting, but the impact of it, particularly at the time, because you do not see that coming. And the severed hand is obviously quite a familiar motif from horror, but usually it's a reanimated hand, isn't it? Usually the threat is coming from the hand, but what this image leaves you with is the sort of feeling of like, oh fuck. And I remember at the time, and I think every time now when I watch it, part of me thinks, I wonder if you actually could do that. If you could rend your hand from your butt, if you were full of enough adrenaline and strong, I don't know. But yeah, that's a shocking image. And the other thing is Alfred Marks as Bellamy. Yes. I think his performance is really, really potent. And I mean, particularly at the time, he was best known as a comedian. He'd had a series called Alfred Marks Time on ITV. And he was a very popular sort of mainstream figure. And obviously, he's doing quite a bit of riffing in this. Again, it sticks fairly closely to how the character portrayed in the book, but he's doing quite a bit of riffing. And if you notice, a couple of times there are uninterrupted, quite lengthy shots where he's just talking the whole time. There's one at the very beginning where I think his opening scene, in fact, where they find the dead body in the park, and then they walk up towards the car and then drive off, and that's all one continuous shot. It's only about a minute or so, but it's quite lengthy. Well, he's riffing the whole time, talking the whole time, getting so much plot over, but he's doing it in a way that you forget it's exposition, because his characterization's so great. He's so witty. He's really callous and tough. but he makes the character really likable. And there's another shot where they're going through the police station, and there's a drunk who's been brought in to go in the cells overnight, and he's been handed reports, and he's being asked questions, and he's trying to pick up a sandwich, and does he want to eat that? Again, it's a minute or so, one continuous shot, and you can see at points in the background a couple of the actors are just like clenching their faces a little bit because they might be about to corpse, and it's just like his energy and his dynamism it really carries it through. And of course, sort of spoiler alert, but when he gets killed, as when Peter Cushing gets killed earlier in the film, that's another real jolt. That's another, you get these jolts of like visceral display, like the wrist and stuff, but you get these jolts when major figures are killed off. When Cushing is killed off about half hour into it, when I saw it, I'd not long before that seen Psycho. I remember thinking, this is like Janet Leigh. We're watching a horror film. Peter Cushing's just been introduced. Right, we're underway now. This is going to be what it's all about. Peter Cushing and how he deals with whatever's happening. And then he's dead straight away in his first scene. And he's not coming back as a ghost or a vampire. He's dead. And similarly, when Alfred Marks is killed, you just think, I thought he was going to solve it all. I thought he was going to be the hero. Now he's dead. And so it's constantly disorienting you. Just as you feel like, all right, the stories have come together now. It's a police procedural thing. Now the policeman's been killed. So where are we now? I think it's really smart storytelling.
It's, well, there's something, in terms of Alfred Marks, because I mean, I knew him more through comedy and stuff, and I think that a lot of people did, and I think that works really well. There's other examples where they've kind of brought in a kind of comedy character to do sort of a more sort of detective type role, and it as a grumpy detective, and it kind of works, and I think it works really well in this. And it reminded me a little bit of Donald Pleasance's detective character in Deathline.
Deathline,
that he is, very grumpy. You don't want to go on the wrong side of him, but he's very playful as well. He's just playing with you, get your bleeding haircut, all that kind of stuff. It's fantastic. It reminded me of that. It's a very sort of British take on that crumpled detective. He's being hounded by the above, stuff, but he's just kind of doing his thing anyway. But I think in terms of like someone like Alfred Marks, I think it's the other thing about those kind of early 70s films, in particular those kind of Amicus films, is the casting. You had these kind of, very much these kind of classic thesps, that are in these films who were brilliant actors, incredible. But then you also had, if you look at a lot of those Amicus films, particularly like,
Roy Castle,
House of Horror,
Alan Freeman,
there's no modern equivalent to that, is there? Roy Castle, Alan Freeman, Kenny Lynch, Christopher Lee. Where's the modern equivalent of that? And
I think one of the interesting things about that is, going back to the comparison with Hammer is, I mean, obviously some of the actors migrated between Hammer and Amicus, but Hammer, this thing, because it was set in the past, it had this idea of almost like it was legitimate theatre. It was like these were proper thespians, and like with some of the Amicus films, or like Deathline or Screaming Again, because you've got characters from other areas of entertainment. Again, it's slightly decentering, and it makes it feel like, it's not as other. It's not as other as like this world of classical acting, it's a curious thing, isn't it? That like you say, there probably isn't really a modern equivalent, because now everything's much more mixed up anyway. You can be a pop star, and you can be an actor, and you can be a painter or whatever. So it doesn't, there's not the delineation anymore, is there? So that's probably one of the reasons there isn't a modern equivalent.
No, but it's kind of like you throw everything into the mix, and on top of everything else, you've got this kind of stuff, and it just kind of it's just, as we mentioned earlier, it's so British. It's such a British thing, I think. I don't even think it's not even though there's not a modern equivalent now. I just don't think there's an equivalent in other countries. I think it's just something we did, and I think it is that mix of the mundane and the fantastic, and I think we do it really well in this country. I'm not saying other countries don't do it at times, but I think I remember, I wrote this book about Alice Lowe's Prevenge. I love that film, and because I think
Mm.
Alice Lowe still understands that. She understands that mix of the mundane and the fantastic, and Prevenge is a really good
Yeah.
example of that. And when we were talking about it, that she said, I was trying to ask her what was why were British films, or even more specifically British horror, why was it different to other cultures? And she said it's kind of like you've got all this kind of fantasy stuff going on, walking by, you got Hobbits and Lord of the Rings and all this kind of stuff, which is very British. But at the same time, across the road, you've got Kathy Burke sat on a wall smoking a fag. It's kind of like in Amicus
Mm.
films, it's the horror. You've got these, it could be a piano that comes to life and is trying to eat you, but in the background, there's a chip wrapper blowing across the street. It's all of this kind of,
Yeah.
it's this raggedy, supernatural sort of over the top unreality meets grotty kitchen sink stuff, and that's what really drives it home. And I think this film does that in spades. I think it's all of this kind of stuff is there.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think one thing that typifies a lot of, for me, what I think of the best of British horror is, I remember reading a quote from Donald Sutherland where he'd been told when he was in the second version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers for his part, he said, act like somebody who doesn't know they're in a film called Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And I think that sort of approach you get a lot in British horror, that like there's no knowingness about it. I think British horror tends to be very unknowing. It tends to be like the characters don't for a second know they're in a horror film. There's no place, not Scream, there's no postmodernism at play. A lot of it is, it's right. I think we're good at getting under the skin of horror in Britain. I think that's the strength we have, that it's about the texture and the quality and the atmosphere and it's not about too many knowing references to other horrors and things like that. I don't know. I think there is something distinct about British horror. I think, at the moment there's this real vogue that everything has to be folk horror, but I think globally we're going through a bit of that anyway. And I think that's perhaps, in the face of the sort of stark happenings of the day, that perhaps a return to a more sort of Edenic would be the wrong word, but a more sort of like fundamental earthy form of horror and storytelling has an appeal in the times when we're surrounded by real modern horrors. In the way that, like, when the Second World War kicked off, for want of a better phrase, surrealism, which had been a dominant form in art, was suddenly moved aside in favor of abstract expressionism, because that was a more contemplative sort of art, and surrealism would churn up your psyche, would make you think about the horror of the void and so on, and the irrationality. It's like, well, we had so much of that in the modern world, so then the shift to, like I say, more contemplative art. And I think there's perhaps something in the way horror's moving at the moment.
Yeah, well, I think, if you think about, I always kind of think about the way that if we talk about film noir, the American film noir features, the post-war sort of film noir. And I think you say that to most people, they might think of, Bogey and kind of hardball detectives, which is absolutely part of it, and a really important part of it. But a lot of those films, particularly those ones with Alan Ladd and other people, they're about kind of people returning from the war, and they're kind of messed up. There's a lot of those film noir films which are kind of a metaphor for PTSD. I mean, people didn't know it as PTSD then, but that's the nation, or those returning vets were just coming back to find their girlfriends with other people, or they didn't fit in anymore. They became these lone outsiders. There's a lot of that stuff going on. But I think horror, and this is why, I'm not saying, I'm slightly disappointed when people say they don't like horror. I get it. If you're not into it, you're not into it. But when people kind of shut it down, I'm not interested, I don't want to do this, because I think horror, particularly in I don't want to overcomplicate it or make it sound too grandiose, but I think horror in these kind of times where we've got all this insane shit going on, you can't do a straight up drama about that. It's not going to work. You just feel like you're being preached to or whatever, or you're going to divide people. Horror, this is where horror steps up. This is where horror can provide, though, you can present something which is so outlandish, as we saw with something like The Substance. It's so outlandish, it's so over the top, and it's not necessarily making a point which hasn't been made before, but the way it's done, you can take that message, or you can just enjoy a very cerebral, strange, over the top horror film. This is where
Yeah.
horror really steps up, and I think horror has always done that. Obviously there are shit horror films or bad horror films, but I think good horror has always done that. It always recognizes, okay, there's a threat on the horizon. How do we do this in a way? Look at look at Get Out and things like that. It's so fucking relevant. It's so brilliant. But again, anytime a horror film does that and it does something really intelligent and really clever, of course you get your Guardian types who immediately jump in, oh, this is not a horror film. It's like, fuck off. It's horror.
Yeah.
Stop taking my things away from me.
Yeah, that's a story as old as time. There's an introduction to a volume of H.G. Wells' The Invisible Man, or certainly the volume I've got, and it's an introduction by his brother, Frank Wells. And he bemoans the fact that he said quite a number of reviewers said about H.G. Wells' stories, oh, they're so good, they're not really science fiction. And it's just like saying, no. Not only are they definitely science fiction, these are the absolute roots of science fiction. That before Wells, there wasn't science fiction. So it's like, don't belittle it on that count. That's its greatest achievement, that it is science fiction. So yeah, I think that thing of like, oh, it's so good, it's not horror. Yeah, I hate that. I mean, I'm trying to think what my favorite. I really enjoyed The Substance. I'm just thinking over recent years. Red Rooms, I thought was a phenomenal horror film, particularly one in which you see hardly any horror of any description. I think then that obviously has a lot to say about current times. I thought Infinity Pool was a fabulous piece of work, and I think that's got a lot to say about modern, modern concerns of all kinds. And Talk to Me, I thought was
just cracking. That is absolutely.
I mean, and that's a difficult watch at times, But I thought, that has so much to say about now, but. Equally, you can just strap yourself in and have a ride, and I think that is one of the great things about the best of horror. It to use a cliche, it works on a number of levels, and you can get a lot. And also, it's the way you were saying earlier about PTSD, that I wouldn't have thought it was called at the time. I think sometimes we're watching stuff, and it's like subconsciously what we're getting out of it is a whole other deal, So I think, and horror's great for that, and because horror puts you on your mettle as a viewer. Horror makes you sort of think, oh, got to look out for, what might be happening next? Is something going to jump out on them? Might there be a jump scare? Am I going to get disturbed by this? Will I need to close my eyes? I think, horror creates a degree of focus in the viewer that you don't, it's very hard to passively watch horror, and I think that can only be a good thing.
I mean, it's slightly, more science fiction, I guess, but, Paul Verhoeven understood this. Paul Verhoeven made these incredibly popular sort of blockbuster science fiction films, which had the best social commentary in them. But if you were completely unaware of that social commentary, you've still got a fucking great film about a man who's turned into a robot cop. It's just, this is what horror understands. And I think sometimes straight up mainstream drama doesn't get it. It just thinks it can just do a very linear kind of, preach to you almost, and that's good enough. And it's not. You've got to do something else,
Yeah. It's very true. I mean, because I spent most of my career creating almost exclusively comedy work. And then when I first started writing drama, I suddenly thought, hang on, this is, I'm not saying it's easy, but it's so much easier than writing comedy, because comedy requires everything that drama requires. Plus, you've got to have lots of extra gags and surprises and little verbal twists and stuff. Drama doesn't demand that in the same way. And horror is another example where it's like you need all the sort of staples of drama, the narrative drive, the characters, and so on. But you've got to have other things as well, which pique different aspects of your sensibilities. So again, horror is doing something, it's doing what drama does, and it's doing something else as well, and I think comedy and horror are so often seen as being sort of lesser members of the drama family, when really they're working twice as hard.
Yeah, I mean, that's why, lots of people said it. It's not just me, but that's why I've got infinite kind of appreciation of, Inside Number Nine, Reece Shearsmith and Steve
Mm,
Pemberton. It's just that they've taken like the two kind of hardest things to do and combined them
yeah,
but combine them into not into a feature film, into 25 minutes.
yeah.
That's fucking rock hard. That's
Oh
really,
yeah,
really
no, it
difficult.
and I think it does that thing that it's like you can't unsee it. Once you've seen that, it's like whatever else you're watching on TV doesn't seem quite as punchy. It's genuinely is one of the, in the same way that like the best of Black Mirror has that
Yeah.
quality. Or certain bands you listen to, and then you listen to something else after, you think, it's all right, yeah. But and I think there's an incredibly high standard of storytelling and performance. I think they're excellent,
Yeah.
excellent work.
Well, I think we've just about exhausted Scream and Scream again.
Okay,
Um, it's been brilliant to chat to you, Graham. Thanks so
and
much
you, Andrew,
for
yeah,
coming on. But thank you so much.
pleasure, man.
I really appreciate it. So, yes. So just remember to call round next time. Make yourself at home. You look like you're dying for a nice cup of tea for terror.
And remember, my friend, future events such as these will affect you in the future.